Hi everybody, it's Sally here. Today I'm just going to do hopefully a fairly short video about sponge bars, what they are, why the machines have them, how do you know when you need to replace it, where to find it, how to take it out and change it and so forth. Most of the Japanese flatbed metal bed, which is bits metal, machines have a sponge bar. It's more correctly called a needle retaining bar, and the purpose of it is to keep your needles on your knitting machine bed flat down to the surface underneath here. It keeps the needles under a bit of tension so that when you push them forward you should be able to feel a bit of resistance, and so therefore when you move the needles around it helps them stay in the position you've set them at, and it helps the carriage to knit them correctly. I say most metal bed machines have them. There might be an odd one or two, or sort of older models that don't. The ribbing attachments also have needle retaining bars, but they aren't always sponge. I'm just going to see if I can pop out my standard gauge one to show you, if I can get hold of it. I've not put it all the way out, but if you have a look down there you can see at the bottom of the image there that there it is, that it's plastic, it hasn't got any sponge on it. That is quite common in standard gauge ribbers, but on the bulky or mid gauge machines the ribbers more commonly actually do have sponge bars as well. So they need to be checked from time to time, although they don't tend to get as much wear as the main knitting machine. So yeah, the purpose therefore of the sponge bar is to keep your needles tensioned and flush down to the surface of the bed of the knitting machine so that the machine can work properly. So I've got a few examples in my sticky fist here. This is a new one I'm going to put into my machine. If you check your sponge bar and it looks anything like that, it is well and truly knackered. If it's somewhere in between the two of them, so once the sponge gets down to being, probably half or less than the original thickness, which is about 8mm, so once you've got 5mm or less on there, it's not really going to like it, and you should really change your sponge bar out. If you aren't too certain whether you need a new sponge or not, take it out and have a look. It's the only way. So where is the sponge located? Well, on the main bed it's located here. It runs all the way across the width of the knitting machine and it's located at the front. You should be able to see a little slot at the side of your knitting bed, which is where the sponge gets pushed in and out. So the reason I thought that my sponge might need replacing was because I could start to feel, you perhaps can't see it, I want to move a little bit closer, particularly not on these edge needles, but on the ones in the middle I could start to feel a little bit of spring and a little bit of give when I tap the needles, which sort of indicates to me that the sponge might be getting a bit low. If you tap your needles and they're bouncing up and down all over the place, then you definitely need a new sponge. You can see this little slot here at the front of the machine. Have a look at where your needle is situated in there. If they're up here, and they're bouncing about, you definitely need a new sponge bar. So they should be down as close as you can get them to the surface of that bed. So see if I can get hold of the end of it with my trusty pliers. No, I can't. I have to poke it from the other end. Where's my poking tool gone? So if you can't get hold of it from the side, go and prod it from the other end, and then you should see the end of it come out here. So I'm going to, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the carriage off the bed. take the carriage off and put it safely on one side, and then pull the sponge bar out. So there you have it. And yes, it is getting a little bit worn. So if I compare it to the new one, you can see the difference between the two of them. Obviously there's the marks where the needles have been resting, and it's lost about 3, maybe 4 millimeters of its thickness. And in certain places it's obviously worse than in others for some unknown reason. But anyway, that is definitely not looking its best anymore, and so I'm going to replace it. Now, here's the illustration about the needles bouncing up and down. If I were to put that dead bar in, which I am going to do just for the purpose of illustration, to put a sponge bar in, you need to get your flat edge transfer tool and push those needles down, because the sponge bar has to be inserted on top of the needles and not underneath. I'm just going to stick this one in. I'm not going to put it all the way in, but just a little way in for the purpose of illustration. So here we go. You've got a dead sponge bar in there, and there's definitely a lot of flex and a lot of bounce on those needles. So again, that's a very good indication that your sponge needs replacing. If you poke it in underneath, which is feasible to do, your needles will be up the top of these slots and again bouncing about. You try to knit on your machine with it like that, you'll end up damaging your carriage, and it certainly will not have anything to do with the ribber. If your sponge bar is shot, you will not get the ribber to knit. So new sponge, most definitely required. So here she is. So to put the sponge bar in, the metal bit goes at the top, the sponge at the bottom, and you're pushing these needles down with the flat edge of your transfer tool and putting the sponge bar in over the top. And as you slide it along, just move the flat edge of your pusher along with it and just keep pushing it in until it's all the way across. As it gets towards the end, it might get a bit stiff to push, but persevere, it will go in. And then you should see it appear in the slot at the other end. You can see it's reached the other end, and just push it in as far as it will go. You shouldn't have any tip sticking out. And there it is, pushed in. Nice new sponge, and my needles are right down flush onto that needle bed now. And I can feel a nice amount of tension as I'm pushing them backwards and forwards. So there you go. That is what your sponge bar is. That is where you find it. That's how you take it out, check it, and replace it. So it is important to keep your knitting machine operating to its best potential, to make sure that you check the sponge bar regularly and replace it as soon as it's needed. I say persisting with a worn out bar is not a good idea. Certain stitch patterns will start to mispattern. Definitely the lace carriage doesn't like a worn sponge bar. The ribber doesn't like a worn sponge bar. So it just pays and will save you a lot of grief if you keep your sponge bar topped up, replaced as soon as it needs to be. So I hope that's answered a few questions for people.